Deep Web Mask Story. Hello, my name is Rupert. The story I'm about to tell you may be something impressive, and you may question whether or not something like this can happen. But I'd assure you that, as someone who lived through it, it's not only real, but it is much worse than I can tell you. It all started when I was just a teenager. My friends and I watch a lot of horror videos, and like any teenager discovering the world of horror, we obviously got interested in the deep web. We followed all the steps to get in. We downloaded Tor and made sure we didn't make any mistakes so they couldn't find our IP. What we didn't know is that this was only good for the lowest levels of the deep web, because if we get too deep into it, nothing can protect us from a hacker attack. We started to see the simplest things on the dark web. Mercenaries, gore images, and people threatening us for no reason. My friend Alan used to make fun of them, as he thought that with all the security measures we took, no one could do anything to us. He was partly right, but where he was wrong was that we would be safe if we continued exploring. We started to go to more dangerous places. We got into the sector of the deep web, known as the deep waters, where the people who inhabit and use it are usually much darker than in previous levels. I have to admit that it was not even worth entering. Every page we entered was a mystery. We understood absolutely nothing. They all had weird images, unknown symbols, and people telling us illogical things. I must admit that I was scared and uncomfortable. Maybe we were getting into something dangerous, and we should have left as soon as possible. Alan disagreed. He wanted to explore more and more, but fortunately, he was getting bored, until we came across the 8th page. Its design was very unusual. The page had a deep red color and strange satanic symbols drawn all over it. You would think this was the work of a teenager trying to get attention, but at this level, the people who inhabited the dark web were much more reserved. This was not normal. We both started checking the site, and nothing made sense. There were many active people, all commenting illogical things to each other, but something that caught our attention is that everyone had the same profile picture. It wasn't a demon, a monster, or a satanic symbol. They all had profile pictures of Will Smith. For a moment, we thought this was a code or an inside joke between friends, but the more we looked at the page, the more we realized that there were a lot of people involved in this. The comments would go live, and they were like 100 people at a time, all posting illogical things with pictures of Will Smith. Suddenly, my webcam turned on, and the mouse pointer went to Google Maps, and what we saw there terrified us. It opened up the location of another person, who, according to the map, was moving in the direction of my house, and he was only a few blocks away. Nervous, I disconnected the computer. Alan wasn't laughing anymore. He was just as terrified as I was. Our cell phones started ringing nonstop, and at the same time, with the same terrified look on our faces, we saw what was going on. We had Instagram notifications. We both had approximately 300 notifications of new people following us. All of these new people had profiles with Will Smith's face on them. Who were these people? Had we stumbled upon a cult? Before we could talk about it, the lights in the house went out. This could not be a coincidence. If those people found us so easily, maybe they also knew where we lived. Maybe, even if it was so quickly, one of them came looking for us. We both turned off our cell phones and hid in the house. Maybe there was no one outside. Maybe we were fine, but there was too much going on at the same time, and it could be dangerous. Suddenly, we heard the doorbell ring. Obviously, we didn't go to the door, but to the window. When I peeked, I realized I didn't have to. As soon as I raised my head, my gaze collided with that of a man who had his face against the window. This person was wearing a Will Smith mask. Behind him, there were dozens of people milling around my yard, all wearing different masks of the actor. All of these people were with red chalk making strange circles, drawing things. With a scream, I jumped back and turned on my cell phone to call the police. As it turned on, someone started banging on the front door nervously. My friend and I ran down the stairs and locked ourselves in the dark. in my parents' room. We both held our breath and listened as suddenly the front door opened and footsteps began to sound in the house. We heard several footsteps up the stairs, and some passed very close to my parents' room. Luckily, I had a pretty big house, but sooner or later we would be discovered. The footsteps in the house sounded more and more distant. I think they were in my room. I took this opportunity to run to my father's closet and grab the small key to the room. And as soon as I locked the door, I began to hear someone on the other side trying to open the door. I held my breath and closed my eyes. Alan also did his best not to give away our position, but he was much more nervous than I was. He was crying, covering his mouth with his hands. Without much effort, the person on the other side gave up and just walked away. We both headed for the window to escape, but a sound interrupted us. At that moment, we didn't realize we weren't alone. A dark silhouette was staring at us from the corner of the room. It was pitch black, and we couldn't see anything, but this silhouette was not one of the masked men. It was more than 2 meters tall, imposing, corpulent, and it seemed to have wings. It was so dark that we couldn't see its body. For a moment I thought it was just a trick of our imagination, but whatever was there was something real because something gave it away. His red eyes glowed in the dark and followed every move we made. Suddenly, we started to get very hot. The place felt like an oven. We felt the agitated breathing of this being closer and closer, and those glowing eyes were just inches away from us. As our attacker approached, one would think that being so close we would be able to see the silhouette better. But no, it was still dark. At that moment, I realized that it wasn't that we couldn't see that being because the lights were off. It was because that being had no form. That being was a shadow. I tried to run as fast as I could, but my legs didn't work. I was paralyzed. The being walked closer and closer, and luckily for me, Alan was closer to it. As it came in contact with my friend, the shadow grabbed his face, and with just its fingers, it smashed it against the floor. Alan couldn't move, he couldn't scream, but I could tell by the way he was shaking that he was still alive. With terrifying ease, the shadow opened its mouth and began to swallow my friend's body. While all this was happening, Alan regained the ability to move, but it was too late. He could only see his feet in desperation as he was swallowed alive. At that moment, I realized that I could move too, so I took the opportunity to run to the window and jump out of it. I fell into the courtyard and broke my arm, but that didn't stop me from running. I ran as fast as I could, and the only time I turned around, the men with the Will Smith mask were still there, looking at me without trying to catch me. When I returned home with the police and my parents, no one could believe what they saw. My whole house was full of satanic drawings. The door to my parents' room was intact. No one had entered, but it had a strange black lipstick drawing on it that was different from the gaudy red they used in the rest of the house. When we entered my parents' room, there was nothing there. The room was an empty square. Not only was my friend not there, but there was no furniture, no paint, nothing. It made no sense. Alan's disappearance was labeled a kidnapping. When I logged back into my social networks, all those people had stopped following me, and I never heard from them again. After some research, I found out that there were many of these satanic sects that did rituals and human sacrifices of people who were too curious. Whatever the case, I never went back to the deep web. I never went back to look for anything from these people. I had seen enough, and as long as they didn't come back for me, I was happy enough. Stalker. My name is Ethan. I have 26, and I love the internet. It is a huge world, almost as big as the real world. On the internet, people play, work, entertain themselves, study, get information, express their opinions, buy, sell, and do many other things that are also done in the tangible world, sometimes even creating significant events in what we biasedly call reality. However, like any large and complex space, the internet has its dark alleys, It's forbidden passages. I am referring to the deep web. This is the hidden face of the internet, the huge iceberg of which we barely know the tip that emerges above the waters. Most people are unaware of it, but the deep web represents about 90% of the information in cyberspace. Ever since I learned that the deep web existed, I wanted to get to know it and dive into its murky waters. I had my fears, but my curiosity was much greater, and after a while of thinking about it, I decided to at least take a little look. I started by entering directly to level 3. Here begins what is forbidden on the official web. Pages whose characters are randomly dropped, pages that cannot be displayed in search engines, and that you cannot see even if you copy the complete link and paste it in the address bar. In this level, there are strange, disturbing, or simply useless things. Webs abandoned for more than 13 years, materials that by copyright are not found in the official web or were found, but are no longer there. Markets of weapons, drugs, instructions on how to make bombs and other things that lend themselves to the illegal, and videos and photos of murders and things much stronger than those that can be found in previous levels, because they can certainly be found, but do not reach the extreme of the materials of that type that appear in this level. It was already said that in the previous level, there is very strong gore material, but here there are live murders, hitmen, and people selling human organs. As the hours passed, I started to get bored and advanced to the next level. If in the previous level, there were compromising things for governments, in this level there are military secrets and the most lurid and inhuman state projects. Here you will know what is that missile that countries are hiding, what cybernetic weapons are hidden, who has the most lethal biological weapons, things like that. It was already said that in the previous level there is very strong gore material, but here there are live murders, hitmen, and even trade in human organs. I entered out of curiosity to one of the famous Red Room videos, and I saw how they murdered a young man of no more than 20 years old. The boy was begging for mercy with all his strength, that he had a family waiting for him, that he never did wrong to anyone. Before murdering him, they sent a poll to the viewers asking them if they should let him live, to which I voted yes. Unfortunately, the rest of the viewers disagreed with me, so the man moved forward again and opened the young man's neck with a precise and quick movement. The camera zoomed in on his gaze as he made a futile attempt to cover his wound by lowering his neck. So, as quickly as it started, the show was over and the lights were turned off, while some men came in to clean up to prepare for the next show. I felt like throwing up and decided to leave as quickly as possible. I wanted to advance to the next level, where there were no more murders, but state secrets and information that people will never know. It took me a long time to get in, but when I finally got in, I understood why everyone stayed in the lower levels. As soon as I logged in, my pay restarted by itself without anything weird popping up on the screen or the power going out. When the reboot process was finally complete, I saw that my hard drive had been wiped. On the entire desktop, there was only one file from the notes block, placed right in the center of the screen, as if to make me notice it. I opened it. Its message was brief, blunt, and somewhat threatening. Don't do it again. I got such a scare that I didn't enter the deep web for several days. In that time, I reinstalled a few things thanks to a backup I had of my data. I thought that was the worst of it, that losing all my data was the biggest punishment I could suffer. I was wrong. A few days later, my curiosity got the better of me, and I logged into Tor and entered the first deep web forum I could find. Of course, I wasn't even at an advanced level yet, but my PC restarted by itself, and the data was deleted again, although now there was no message on the desktop. Was I simply being banned from the deep web from my computer forever? 20 minutes after the new reboot and formatting, I knew better. The doorbell rang. I asked who it was from the door's phone, and no one answered. Then I went down to the front door of the building, but no one was there. Only an envelope was waiting for me, just under the door. It had no return address, addressee, or anything written on it, although I sensed it was for me. I went back upstairs to my apartment, went into my room, and just there, opened the envelope once I was sitting on my red carpet. "Ethan, this is not a game. Don't do it again. Don't make us come after you." As I read it, my hands began to shake and tears slipped down my cheeks. Whoever they were, they knew who I was, where I lived, what I did, and when. To top it off, next to the message was a picture of me, taken with my own webcam. Next to it, pictures of all my family, my friends, even my little sister who was still in kindergarten. In an act of desperation, I grabbed the phone and dialed the police number. I had no idea what to say to them when they answered. Deep inside, I knew there was nothing they could do. But before I was answered, I saw through the computer's reflection a hooded man with his face covered coming right at me. When I turned around to defend myself, it was too late. The man grabbed my head and began slamming it against my keyboard. As he did so, I heard his voice distorted by a device telling me, "I told you this is not a game." I was still dizzy and thought about mustering all my strength to get away. But suddenly I felt a cold prick in my arm. A few seconds later, I became very sleepy and, surrendering to whatever they had injected me with, I closed my eyes. When I woke up, my house was in perfect condition, but something was wrong with the computer. It wouldn't turn on. After checking in, I noticed that it was missing the hard drive, video card, processor, and RAM memory. This man who visited me had taken the most expensive components and had rendered it useless. But at the time, I didn't really care. I was so terrified that in that week, I asked at work to be transferred to another city. No matter where I went, I always felt watched. Every time I left my house, I could see strange people staring at me. At first, I thought for sure it was nothing. Just my imagination combined with my paranoia playing tricks in my head. But as time went by, I began to realize that my hunch was real. I would always run into the same people. They were always staring at me. And to make it scarier, I could see them outside my house, looking at me through the window, watching me. They never bothered to hide their presence, and I knew it was intentional. They certainly didn't plan to do anything to me, but we both knew that the simple fact that I was there was a message. I didn't have to meddle in matters that were none of my business, or I would suffer the consequences. Naturally, you can imagine that I never took any risk again. I never entered the deep web again, and I don't think I will ever try it again, no matter where I am in the world. Fate had been cruel to me, but after remembering how I was at the mercy of this man, asleep, it makes me think that in spite of everything, I am very lucky to be alive. Red Room. My name is Jane, and I am 23. Every day, I remember that night as if it were yesterday. I was 18 years old, and my mom was on vacation. We had returned from the beach a few days earlier, but because of her seniority, my mom still had a week and a half to rest. That day, my mom didn't feel like cooking, so we decided to order food. My 9-year-old cousin was with us, and he had insisted all night that he wanted pizza, so we indulged him. While we were choosing between the pizza varieties, I created a Tinder account for my mother so she can entertain herself. Once we finished ordering, we just watched TV, but after an hour, my mom was surprisingly entertained and talking. I walked over out of curiosity to see my mother, and she was on a Google Meet call. She was interacting with a young man no more than 30 years old. The young man had blonde hair and brown eyes. The man smiled when he saw me, and when I asked my mother what was going on, she told me that they were just talking, and that the man asked her to continue the chat with a video call, since that was a normal thing between people on Tinder. Furious, I yelled at the man for lying to my mom. Whatever his intentions, he was taking advantage of her innocence with social media. Without waiting for his response, I tried to close Google Meet, but it didn't react. Somewhat confused, I opened the task manager and deleted the app's window, but it still wouldn't close. At that moment, I realized that the computer was malfunctioning as the man started talking to me. He was mocking me, asking if I'm not closing the app because I love him or something. I was about to turn off the computer, But before I did, the man asked me if I was sure my mom would like anchovies on pizza. Shocked, I stopped halfway to close the notebook. As if the man knew what I was about to ask him, he kept talking. The man's voice had suddenly changed. His relaxed and humorous appearance had become serious and composed. This man seemed to perfectly calculate every word that came out of his mouth. He told me that no matter how, he knew everything about me and my mother. He knew the pizza we ordered. He knew my name and my age, and even he knew where we lived. I didn't know what to answer. Frozen with fear, I closed the notebook. I knew it was a bad idea. I knew it would accomplish nothing, and that possibly all the man's threats were real. I just didn't know what to do. Immediately after I did this, I got several messages on my cell phone. The first messages told me to open the notebook, that what I was doing made no sense, and that I would regret it. Without realizing it, my body began to shake wildly. From one moment to the next, I felt very agitated and dizzy. This had nothing to do with the man. I was having a panic attack. Somehow, I forced myself to look at the new messages. Those messages were pictures of my house, of my mother, even pictures of me sleeping. The last of those messages said, "Please open the computer again." Against my better judgment, I did. In doing so, the man told me nothing, but instead, I received an attachment that I innocently opened knowing that it could be a virus, but it wasn't. It was a video of my cousin. He was in the other room, talking to my mother about pizza while my mother was smiling, trying not to cry. This video was live. There were cameras in the house. I left the computer and went quickly to the other room, exploring it frantically until I found the little camera hidden in a vase, which I smashed wildly in front of my mother and cousin. The boy was confused. He didn't understand anything of what was happening. My mother, on the other hand, looked at me terrified with a complicit face. She was listening to the whole conversation and knew what was going on. We both looked at each other with tears in our eyes. My mother gave me a hug, and I sadly told her I had to go back. Trying not to panic so as not to scare my cousin, she just let me go with a forced smile. Once I returned to the room, the recording was over, and I was seeing again the inflexible face of that man, who was looking at me as if he was dead. I, on the other hand, had my eyes wide open, still in shock at what I had just seen. At that point, I realized that I was facing a hacker, and a dangerous one. After giving me a few seconds to compose myself, the hacker told me to open the door and not to lock myself in, since he noticed that my mother was listening anyway. I asked him to leave us alone. I asked him not to involve my mother or my cousin, but he ignored me, and with just a grimace on his face, I knew I had to listen to him. I went to open the door, and when I did, my cousin looked at me with some curiosity. Although my mother tried to distract him, he was already attentive to everything I said. The terrifying man smiled and waved to my mother and cousin from a distance, and then turned to me. He told me that the demonstrations were over, and that if I closed the notebook again, everyone in the house would die instantly. At that precise moment, the apartment doorbell rang, and my mother answered it. It was the delivery guy. Meanwhile, the hacker kept talking to me. He told me that my mother should take the savings she keeps behind a hole in the wall covering a painting and leave it to the delivery guy as a tip. He told me to hurry, as the delivery guy had a lot of work to do that night. As I turned around to talk to my mom, she already had the money, and with tears in her eyes, she told me she loved me and went downstairs to deliver the money. At that moment, a second camera opened to the entrance of the apartment, where we could see how some men grabbed my mother, who, even though she screamed and resisted, could not do anything against the men who put her in a van and accelerated. As we cried, my cousin, and I tried to reason with the man. But it was futile. He just looked at us with his cold look. I still remember how desperate I was. I tried to call the police, but my phone had no signal. I tried to escape from the house, but we were locked in. I even shouted, but no neighbor approached. It was as if everyone was involved in this. After a few minutes, the man, who had silently observed all our desperation, spoke again. He told us to look at the screen. Suddenly, another window had opened, and in it was my mother. She was tied to a chair. She was in a dimly red-lit room. Then a masked man rushed up to my mom and violently choked her with a bag. My cousin and I screamed desperately in indescribable pain. It was as if the world had come crashing down on us in just a minute. But that was the longest minute in my life, until the second that my mother finally lost her life. The camera was replaced with a photo of a vote that read as follows: Mother, 47%. Daughter, 31%. Child, 22%. While we looked at the numbers, the man's voice sounded again. Congratulations, little Jane. I want you to know that not everyone turns around a result in such a way. But apparently, our sponsors liked you so much that they decided they wanted to see you as an orphan. Kids usually lose, especially if the parents are home to witness their punishment. Anyway, it was a good show, one of the best of the week. I wish you, kids, a good life. And so, as soon as it started, the nightmare ended. The next night, my aunt came to pick up her son and found out everything that happened. She started taking care of me from then on, although a few years later, I inherited my mother's share after my grandparents passed away, and I was able to live on my own. As I grew up, I didn't follow in my family's footsteps, but I started studying computer security, knowing that someday, somewhere in the deep web, I will find the people who killed my mother.